Despite possessing vast resources, in the 1800s, Russia's social system and economy were the least advanced in Europe. In addition, Russia had an absolute monarchy in which the ruling czars were reluctant to embrace reforms that might threaten their hold on power. This was especially the case with Alexander III, who became Tsar in 1881 after the assassination of his father. Alexander believed in autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality. Anyone who questioned the Tsar's absolute authority, worshipped outside the Russian Orthodox Church, or spoke a language other than Russian was considered dangerous. Alexander imposed strict censorship on published materials and used his secret police to intimidate and terrorize the people. To maintain his control and establish a uniform Russian culture, Alexander implemented harsh repressive policies, including the suppression of non-Russian cultures in his empire and Jews. New laws prevented Jews from buying land, attending universities, or living with other Russians. Organized violence, in the form of vicious pogroms, became common throughout Russia. When Alexander died, his son Nicholas II continued many of his father's policies. Like Alexander, he promoted industrialization, including the building of mines, factories, and railroads. Nicholas' brilliant minister, Sergei Veit, used high taxes and foreign loans to build up Russia's economy. Under Nicholas and Veit, the number of factories in Russia doubled, and the country became the fourth largest producer of steel, behind the United States, Germany, and Great Britain. One of their greatest achievements was the construction of the magnificent Trans-Siberian Railway. This railway was important in unifying Russia and strengthening its economy because it linked Russia's ports on the Pacific Ocean to the cities and resources of the West. Economic expansion came at a cost, however, as workers faced misery in overcrowded, filthy cities and brutal conditions and long hours in the factories. Everywhere in Russia there was poverty, disease, and filth. Unlike Germany, Britain, and the US, in Russia the people had little faith in the ability of their government to fix these problems. The problems in Russia led to the rise of many revolutionary groups and leaders. One of the most influential was Vladimir Lenin. When he was 17, his older brother was arrested and hanged for plotting to kill the Tsar. The execution branded his family a threat to the state and made the young Vladimir hate the Tsarist government. As a young man, Lenin read the works of Marx and participated in student demonstrations. He spread Marxist ideas among factory workers until he was arrested in 1895 and sent to Siberia. After his release, he went into exile in Switzerland, where he worked tirelessly to spread revolutionary ideas. Lenin adapted Marxist ideas to fit Russian conditions. Marx had predicted that the industrial working class would rise spontaneously to overthrow capitalism, but Russia did not have a large urban proletariat. Instead, Lenin called for an elite group to lead the revolution. Though this elite revolutionary party represented a small percentage of socialists, Lenin gave them the name Bolsheviks, meaning majority. In Western Europe, many leading socialists had come to think that socialism could be achieved through gradual and moderate reforms, such as higher wages, increased suffrage, and social welfare programs. A group of socialists in Russia, the Mensheviks, favored this approach. The more radical Bolsheviks rejected this approach because, to Lenin, reforms of this nature were merely capitalist tricks to suppress the masses. Only violent revolution, he said, could bring about needed changes. A turning point came with the Revolution of 1905. Dissatisfaction with industrialization, opposition to government repression, and news of military defeats in the Russo-Japanese War against Japan led to widespread unrest in Russia in 1905. On Sunday, January 22nd, a peaceful protest calling for reforms turned deadly when the Tsar's troops opened fire on the crowd. This bloody Sunday sparked revolts across Russia. In response, Nicholas issued the October Manifesto, promising reforms. He agreed to summon the Duma, the elected national legislature, but then dissolved it when its leaders criticized his policies. Nicholas appointed a new prime minister, Peter Stolypin, who at first continued to use terror against the Tsar's political opponents. Stolypin eventually supported reforms, but they were too late and too limited to result in effective change, and he was assassinated in 1911. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 fueled national pride and united Russians. But like the Crimean and Russo-Japanese wars, World War I quickly strained Russian resources. Factories could not turn out enough supplies, and the limited transportation system could not get enough materials to the front. By 1915, many soldiers had no rifles and no ammunition. Badly equipped and poorly led, they died in staggering numbers. Facing military collapse, Nicholas II went to the front to take personal charge. The decision proved a disastrous blunder because the Tsar was no more competent than his generals. Worse, he left domestic affairs to his wife, Alexandra. In Nicholas's absence, Alexander came to rely on the advice of Rasputin, an illiterate peasant who claimed to be a holy man and have special healing powers. By helping Alexandra's son, who suffered from hemophilia, he won her support. By 1916, Rasputin's influence over Alexandra had reached new heights and weakened confidence in the government. Fearing for the monarchy, a group of Russian nobles killed Rasputin, further destabilizing the government. By March 1917, disasters on the battlefield, combined with food and fuel shortages on the home front, caused the monarchy to collapse. In St. Petersburg, workers were going on strike. Marchers, mostly women, surged through the streets demanding bread. Troops refused to fire on the demonstrators, leaving the government helpless. Finally, on the advice of military and political leaders, the Tsar abdicated. The March Revolution succeeded in ending the rule of the Tsars, but it failed to set up a strong government that could solve Russia's enormous problems. Instead, the leaders of the Duma created a provisional government that would rule temporarily while middle-class liberals in the government began preparing a constitution for the new Russian Republic. At the same time, they continued the war against Germany. Outside the provisional government, revolutionary socialists plotted their own course. In Petrograd and other cities, they set up Soviets, or radical councils of workers and soldiers. At first, the Soviets worked democratically within the government, but they soon became more radical as they grew frustrated with the ineptitude and corruption of the provisional government. They began demanding more political and economic changes, but lacked unity. Strong leadership for the Soviets came in 1917, when Germany helped Lenin return to his country in the hope that he would launch a revolution that would take Russia out of the war. Now back in Russia, Lenin threw himself into the work of furthering the revolution. Another dynamic Marxist revolutionary, Leon Trotsky, helped lead the fight. To the hungry, war-weary Russian people, Lenin and the Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread. Meanwhile, the provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, continued the war effort but failed to deal with land reform. Those decisions proved fatal. Most Russians were tired of war. Troops at the front were deserting in droves. Peasants wanted land, while city workers demanded an end to the desperate shortages. In July 1917, the provisional government launched the disastrous Kerensky offensive against Germany. After devastating losses, growing numbers of troops mutinied. While at home, peasants seized land and drove off fearful landlords. Conditions were ripe for the Bolsheviks to make their move. In November 1917, squads of Red Guards, who were armed factory workers, joined mutinous sailors from the Russian fleet in attacking the provisional government. In just a matter of days, the November Revolution resulted in Lenin's forces overthrowing the provisional government with barely a struggle. After seizing power and taking control of the capital city of Moscow, the Bolsheviks moved to put their ideas into effect in Russia. They ended private ownership of land and redistributed land to peasants. Workers were given control of factories and mines. A new red flag with an entwined hammer and sickle symbolized the union between workers and peasants. Throughout Russia, millions thought they had at last gained control over their own lives. In fact, the Bolsheviks, renamed communists, would soon become their new masters. After the revolution, Lenin quickly sought peace with Germany. Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, giving up a huge chunk of its territory and its population. The cost of peace was extremely high, but the communist leaders knew that they needed all their energy to defeat a collection of enemies at home. The Bolsheviks, now called communists and known as Reds, faced intense opposition that led to the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1922. The counter-revolutionary forces became known as Whites, and were made up of Tsarist imperial officers, Mensheviks, Democrats, and others, all of whom were united only by their desire to defeat the Bolsheviks. Nationalist groups from many of the former empire's non-Russian regions joined them in their fight. Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania broke free, but nationalists in Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia were eventually subdued. The Allies intervened in the Civil War in the hope that the Whites might overthrow the Communists and support the fight against Germany. Britain, France, and the United States sent forces to help the Whites. The Reds appealed to nationalism and urged Russians to drive out the foreigners. In the long run, the Allied invasion fed communist distrust of the West. The Russian Civil War was a brutal conflict. Counter-revolutionary forces slaughtered captured communists and tried to assassinate Lenin. The communists shot the former Tsar, his wife, and their 5 children to keep them from becoming a rallying symbol for counter-revolutionary forces. The communists used terror not only against the Whites, but also to control their own people. They organized the Cheka, a secret police force much like the Tsars. The Cheka executed ordinary citizens even if they were only suspected of taking action against the revolution. The communists also set up a network of forced labor camps. The communists adopted a policy known as war communism. They took over banks, mines, factories, and railroads. Peasants were forced to deliver almost all of their crops to feed the army and hungry people in the cities. Peasant laborers were drafted into the military or forced to work in factories. Meanwhile, Leon Trotsky turned the Red Army into an effective fighting force. He used former Tsarist officers under the close watch of commissars, or Communist Party officials, assigned to the army to teach party principles and ensure party loyalty. The Reds' position in the center of Russia gave them a strategic advantage. The disorganized white armies were forced to attack separately from all sides, and were never able to cooperate effectively with one another. By 1921, the Communists had managed to defeat their scattered foes. In the early 1920s, Lenin retreated from his policy of war communism, which had brought the economy to near collapse. Under party control, factory and mine output had fallen, and peasants stopped producing grain, knowing the government would only seize it. In 1921, Lenin adopted the New Economic Policy, which allowed some small-scale capitalist ventures in order to revive Russia's shattered economy. Although the state kept control of banks, foreign trade, and large industries, some businesses were allowed to reopen for private profit. The government also stopped squeezing peasants for grain. Under the NEP, peasants held on to small plots of land and freely sold their surplus crops. Lenin's compromise with capitalism helped the Soviet economy recover and ended armed resistance to the new government. By 1928, food and industrial production had rebounded, and the standard of living had improved. But Lenin always saw the NEP as just a temporary retreat from communism. It was abandoned by his successors. In 1922, Lenin's communist government united much of the old Russian Empire into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or Soviet Union. The communists produced a constitution that seemed both democratic and socialist. It set up an elected legislature, later called the Supreme Soviet, and gave all citizens over 18 the right to vote. All political power, resources, and means of production would belong to workers and peasants. The Soviet Union was a multinational state made up of European and Asian peoples. In theory, all the member republics shared certain equal rights. Reality, however, differed greatly from theory. The Communist Party, not the people, reigned supreme. Just as the Russian czars had, the party used the army and secret police to enforce its will. Russia, which was the largest republic, dominated the others.